Hi, what lurks beneath. My name is Sam, and I have some pretty intense things to tell you about. Things that I've been seeing recently. To bring you up to speed, ever since COVID has hit, I've since lost my job of 6 years. So, that's given me a lot of downtime to be home, and, fortunate for me, I've been able to acquire a databasing job online. So now, I can work from home. But now, this all leads up to the story that I want to tell you. I live kind of out in the middle of nowhere, as I'm sure many people who write to you do. My outer environment isn't as cliche as many would like to believe. No, I'm not surrounded by thick forests or woods, or anything like that. Surrounding me is actually a lot of dead zone, old agricultural farmland that is not being used currently. I'm not exactly sure if it's not owned, or whoever does own it is just neglecting it. Either way, directly behind my house that I'm currently renting is a very, very large field that's currently not being used at all. I'm pretty sure at some point or another, the large field behind my house was directly used for harvesting hay, since the large tire tracks of tractor marks on the sides of my house is pretty desolate as well, just large empty fields with a few trees here and there, but pretty much no coverage. And directly in front of my house is maybe 50 feet of grass and a tiny road that takes you around the area. There's not really any neighbors out here either, so it's pretty much just me. Luckily for me though, I got pretty good internet and I got the house for a good deal. It's an older place for sure, but it does provide plenty of shelter and protection. Anyway, now that I've given you enough backstory so you kind of understand where my situation is, here is where my story begins. So, going back to what I said, I lost my job at the beginning of April, and since then, have been home pretty much the entire last 6 months. Yikes, right? Well, that's what you get for living out in the middle of nowhere. No friends really want to visit you. So, I've spent a lot of my time taking up new hobbies, and acquiring that new databasing job. The reason all of this is relevant is because since I'm home, I've been able to see things that I never noticed before. I've been living at this location for around 3.5 years now, and my old job kept me so busy and out of the house, I don't think I ever would have noticed this happening had I continued that job and not lost it. But since being home so frequently, I now notice this phenomenon, as I like to call it. What exactly am I talking about? Well, I know this sounds crazy. At least I thought I was crazy, until I decided to dig around online, more specifically YouTube, and found out that there are tons upon tons of people with very similar sightings and experiences, just like I. What I'm talking about are large, upright walking wolves, and not just one, or two, or even 3. I'm talking about an entire pack, like 8 or 9 of them. However many is traditionally in a pack of wolves, I don't know. I'll see them sometimes in the evening and early morning hours, roaming in a tight militant unit, walking from one end of the field, far off to the other, past the distance of my visibility. They don't seem to show any interest in my house, or coming near me. They're far from the field, but these animals, beings, whatever you call them, are so large, they really do stick out like a sore thumb. Lucky for them, besides me, there's really nobody else out here to see them. No wandering visitors just passing by. And the road in front of my house, even though it is a public highway, technically, it's pretty dead. There might be 5 or 6 cars that drive through it the entire day, which is saying a lot. And that's what I consider a busy day. I guess I should probably be more frightened by this incident, but after seeing it several times for the last few months, I haven't really grown weary or terrified of these things. More curious at this strange phenomenon. I'm not exactly sure what they are, or if they're human or part human or animal, because to my knowledge of the animal kingdom, there is no canid animal that walks upright just like a man does, and walks in a pack. Unfortunately, because they're so far away, I can't really give you specifics on what they look like, just like the color of fur or any other specific details that they might have. But I can definitely tell these are somewhat canid creatures that are clearly bipedal. That's enough for me. At first, I kind of chalked up the idea of werewolves, but quickly dismissed the notion because, well, 1, that's silly, and 2, werewolves don't exist. If these are some sort of unknown animal, I think there's a good reason to explain their existence and why they're there. They always seem to be traveling from the same point A to the same point B. Point A being when you step out my back door, all the way to the very back of the field, to the far right. They seem to be coming from that direction. Then, they head all the way to point B, which is to my far left at the other end of the field. Why they never come close to the house, or seem to show any interest, is beyond me. At first I didn't think that, but after listening to several stories and encounters, I painted a different picture of these things, that they were bloodthirsty and wanted to instill fear in their victims. I mean, I don't try and hide my presence living in this house. I'm not overly loud or obnoxious, but I don't hide the fact that I live here, so I'm sure they must know. I don't see them every day, or every morning or every night, but I do consider I see them often, maybe a few times a week, and it's always either the early morning hours or the evening time, maybe like 6 p.m., 7 p.m., just as dusk is starting to really set. Part of me wonders if these predatory animals are patrolling the perimeter of an area that they claim is theirs. I have never tried to walk to the back end of the field. Sure, I've stepped foot on the field itself, just to check it out when I first moved in, which is why I told you about the tire marks and the tractor marks, which leads me to believe that this field was once used for hay harvesting. But, since no one currently owns it or is in use, it's pretty much just a dead field of grass and dirt, which leads me to assume that these creatures are probably coming from far off in the distance, where there is woods. But when I say far off in the distance, I mean probably a couple miles off in the distance. Like I said before, surrounding me is just empty fields, with few trees here and there. And when I say few trees, I'm literally speaking a few trees. One tree here, one tree there. Very sparsely spread out, and pretty much provides zero coverage of shadows or anything to hide behind. So, I'm not exactly sure where these things are coming from, or where they're coming to. And if they are what they claim to be, judging by stories and encounters from your YouTube alone, then why would they want to reveal themselves like this? Why would they put themselves in a spot of vulnerability where others can see them? I mean, I don't think they know that nobody else is out here. I would love to know your thoughts on the matter, and what exactly you think they're doing, because I'm pretty sure without a doubt that the only thing that can make up what this is a Dogman. But why would they be out here, in the middle of nowhere, revealing themselves, and being completely vulnerable, with nowhere to hide or anywhere to cover? Part of me speculates that if I go beyond further of the field, there might be underground tunnels, but I have absolutely zero proof of any of that, and it's just a wild guess. About 10 or so years ago, I was driving back from visiting my parents. My then 3-year-old son was fast asleep in the back, so when I couldn't hold the need to use a bathroom any longer, I decided to pull off the highway at the first rest stop I could find. I knew I should have gone to the bathroom at my parents', but you know how it is when you're trying to get out of there, and you don't want one thing to hold you back. I decided I would try and wait till I got home, but clearly, that did not work out for me. Despite looking like something you'd find in a serial killer movie, needs must, and I rushed over to the ladies' room, leaving my son asleep in the car. There was no one else around, and I would be quick. It seemed a less painful option, rather than waking him up and dragging him kicking and screaming into the dirty bathroom with me. I was super fast, and hurried back to the car, where I found my kid awake and staring out the window intently. He didn't seem too upset to have woken up in a strange place, and no mama in sight. So, I counted my blessings, and I rolled with it. We were quickly back on the highway. Thank the Lord. He was still looking pretty out of it. You know, the way preschoolers have about them when they first wake up. Kind of like they don't know where they're at. And was nursing on a juice box. So it took a little while before he spoke. I remember he asked me a question, and I answered back to him, looking in my rearview mirror right at him. He just tells me he saw a really big doggy. I asked him, a big dog, huh? I asked almost absent-mindedly, not really questioning it as a kid, because kids always remember things they saw a month ago with no context. And a 3-year-old being a 3-year-old could have easily saw a dog that he would have considered big. But this was late at night, with nobody else around. In hindsight, there was nobody, or should have been nobody, walking their Great Dane or large dog around. I mean, it happens, but probably not. My son went on to tell me that this dog was real big, just like Daddy. And I remember I asked him, like Daddy? It almost made me chuckle. My husband is 6'2", so I guess he would be considered really tall. My son just kept saying, yes, Mama, real tall, just like Daddy. That's what I told him. We carried on driving for a while, not really thinking too much. That's until I saw a sign for a roadside diner, and thought it might be a good idea to stop for an early dinner. Pulling into the parking lot, we drove into a space, and I got out and stretched my legs. Unbuckling my son, I lifted him into my arms and locked the door. Something on the roof of the car caught my eye. A dent, and what looked like several scratches, which had not been where we left for our trip. I cursed, immediately getting angry. What on earth could have done that? Those markings weren't there when I left my parents. My son looked into my eyes, and a solemn look upon his face, and said, I told you, Mama. It was the big doggy. Have you ever experienced that emotion of total and utter dread? You know, where your skin is covered in goose flesh, and you feel sick to your stomach. Like the pit of your stomach just sucks in everything around it. It's like feeling death. What doggy? I asked. He told me the big one, from the place she went potty. I looked back to the scratches on the roof. There was no way in hell any dog could have made those. I asked him, what do you mean a big doggy? I kept asking, wishing he would make sense. But I guess wishing for a 3-year-old to make sense is like asking, like an utter miracle. My son looked at me, calmly said this, yeah, Mama, the big doggy, tall like Daddy, with a doggy face. When you went potty, he came over to the car to see me. He stood real close, and then he ran away. I think he heard you coming back. I'll never know for sure what my son saw that day. He's, of course, now a teenager, and a total brat, but I love him, and he hasn't mentioned it for years. But I will never forget. In fact, I've even tried to talk to my son about it for a while, and he doesn't really remember. Obviously, being 3 years old, you can't really recount those kind of memories, unless they're usually very specific or traumatic. But anyway, I'll never know exactly what happened that night. Fast forward a few years when my son was 7 or 8, we ended up getting rid of the car, so it's not like I have the evidence anymore. But I'll never know what exactly climbed on top of the car, and who knows if it was truly planning to wait and try and steal my son out of the vehicle. One of my best friends since college has Native American heritage, and let me tell you, some of the stories he had passed down from his grandparents literally beat any movie in terms of scare factor, hands down. In fact, several of them alone involved Wendigo and skinwalkers, which are quite frankly terrifying. But for some reason, the tales that seemed to frighten me the most, the ones that left me with sleepless nights, were the stories about Dogmen. See, although the stories about the Wendigo and skinwalkers were amazing, they had, of course, supernatural and fantastical elements to them, which left you feeling like they were indeed just stories. Nightmare-inducing for sure, for stories nevertheless. But Dogman, for some reason, it really just resonated with me. Now, my friend was very clear that these dog people were not to be confused with werewolves. Whilst the lore of the Lycans meant those creatures changed due to the lunar cycle, Dogmen were canine humanoids all the time. It's just what they were. They were their own beings and were not humans that transform. That is what scared me, even more terrifying than the concept of a werewolf. But what also gave credence to his story was that there was one particular encounter that wasn't simply passed down while he sat on his granddad's knee. This was a story which was far more relevant and believable, simply because it actually happened to my friend himself. He didn't grow up on the res, but he would regularly visit, and would often wander off exploring for hours, feeling totally safe and at ease there. One day, he was playing in the woods that sprawled out behind the houses when he found a couple of dead rabbits. No surprise in that since there were all sorts of predators out there, he needed to be mindful of them. I mean, after all, nature is pretty chaotic and random, and if you're not prepared for it, it will not be merciful. But these rabbits hadn't been stunned, or even killed for food, it seemed. They'd been ripped into pieces, like something picking them up and just pulling them apart, piece by piece. Think of a piece of paper, crumpled up, and then just ripped in pieces. That's the best way he could explain it to me. So you can imagine that the visuals were less than pleasant to look at. He was more curious than afraid this time, wondering what would choose to do that. I mean, sure, plenty of things hunted for food. That just was the circle of life. But to play with it like that was far more destructive than essential for survival. Going further into the woods, for the first time in all of his years exploring, he felt a sense of disturbance, as if something was lurking in the trees, waiting, watching his every move. This is when he tells me that for the first time, he saw it. He specifically remembered that it was very tall, but yet also skinny and kind of frail, but not deathly frail. It was completely covered in dark fur, although it did look matted and mangy. It appeared to have patches of scabby skin showing through. The animal or creature he saw was clearly bipedal and stood on two bowed legs. It had a very clear and striking resemblance of a head of a dog, kind of like a German shepherd with a mix of Doberman. Not a wolf at all, and my buddy has always made this very clear. The head was no doubt a dog, and he can only guess that this creature he was looking at was indeed a dog man. Although he claimed to be absolutely petrified, he recalled feeling no intentional malice towards him. It felt in many ways that although this thing in front of him was the stuff of literal nightmares, it didn't show any interest at all in attacking him. But he remembers this feeling very vividly. There seemed to be an implied danger, as if were he to threaten the creature, then the creature would simply retaliate. And trust me, it wouldn't be pretty. So, he did what pretty much every single one of us would have done in that scenario. He turned and ran all the way back to his aunt's house, and told everybody what he'd seen. And what did they do? Did they chuckle, ruffle his hair, and cite an overactive imagination? Did they grab their guns and head off into the woods, storming to kill the beast? No. They simply nodded and suggested that it might not be best to go back into the woods for quite some time. And you know what happened? He never went back, because he truly believes in order to avoid these creatures, you need to stay out of their territory. It all comes down to respect, he believes. That even though these things don't necessarily respect us, but if we respect them, they seem to be much more honorable of staying away from us, or so he believes. Since I personally don't believe in Dogman or have any experience with them, I can't agree or disagree. But since it's coming from him, which I hold as a very credible witness, I'll take his word for it, and if I ever see one of these things, I'll make sure to stay far away from any territory it might claim. A few years ago, I was staying with a buddy in his huge rambling farmhouse out in rural Texas. When I say rural Texas, I mean it. This place is out there. This place was massive and had a ton of land surrounding it. We were both writers, or should I say aspiring writers, and it was the perfect place for both of us to lock ourselves away and get on with the novels we were planning. There were plenty of deer on the property, just wandering around aimlessly, and my buddy was pretty protective of them. A couple of times over the last week or so, we'd found one mauled to death at the edge of his land. Never pretty, and upset him a lot. I mean, this guy loved doe, especially doe, mainly because we never saw any big bucks around. It was just a large congregation of doe everywhere. He would constantly be setting out apples for them to eat, and any other salt licks he could find, sticking them around, hoping to draw them in. I think his plan was to pet one, and probably befriend one. When it happened for the third time, a deer being mutilated and found, despite it being what can happen often in nature, he decided to put down coyote traps, as he presumed that that was hurting his deer. Like I just explained, he became pretty obsessive and very possessive of these deer. Maybe it was coincidence, but there wasn't another attack for a few weeks, so he was sure that the traps drove away the coyotes. I mean, this was a good thing, as we had seen a few fawn, and then he was beginning to get really anxious that they would be easy pickings if the coyotes returned. After all, fawns are pretty defenseless. He even took to sleeping downstairs, a shotgun next to the door, so he could rush out and help if needed. I thought he was crazy. But then it does get crazier, because one night, we both heard an unmistakable howl outside. Even as a writer, although we both pen crime drama, nothing in the horror genre, I would struggle to put into words exactly what it sounded like, so the term howl is the best that I can come up with. I think it is the single most terrifying noise I have ever experienced, and I was in the delivery room with my wife when she gave birth to our twins, without painkillers. Needless to say, I bolted down the stairs to find my buddy and the gun gone, the front door side open. I threw on some boots, since you never walk outside in Texas without boots, and ran down to the traps. That was when I saw it for the first time. Despite standing with a gun aimed right at it, my buddy was frozen. I mean, I can't say I blame him. For there, in the trap, was what I can only describe as a wolfman. Now, I heard the audible gasp, the disbelief. Why on earth would I jump to that conclusion? Surely it was just a large coyote, or maybe a wolf. Well, let me ask you this. Did you ever see a coyote stand on two legs, just like a person, and walk upright? No? Did you ever see one that had a long skinny body and arms with hands, resembling that of a raccoon's? Not paws and not human hands. I didn't think so. Have you ever seen one covered in hair so dark that it literally absorbed the light around it? I wasn't sure you did. And have you ever looked at its face and thought, that looks like a wild dog? but with human eyes. I bet you haven't. This thing was caught in the coyote trap. It was huge, taller than both me and my buddy, and we're both 6 feet, ballpark. This thing was mad, viscerally angry, veins popping, mouth frothing as it pulled violently against the trap. Shoot, I stage whispered to my buddy, and he just seemed to snap out of his trance. He raised his gun and fired off a shot. Normally, he's a pretty good aim, but I think the fear overtook him so much, which led to unsteady hands, and the shot went wide. What it did achieve, however, was to fire up this thing even more. It gave another howl, although now being closer, it almost sounded like a human scream, like the Incredible Hulk. It ripped itself out of the trap. We were now the ones screaming, and the gun was going off as my buddy was just shooting wildly at this thing, like he was playing Doom. I don't know how he could have missed every shot, but we'll never know, because this dog-man creature wolf thing ran off. It never came towards us, and seemed to be more pissed at being caught than wanting to hurt us or retaliate. The deer, of course, had all fled, due to all the commotion, and I'd felt like it took quite some time for them to feel brave enough or safe enough to come back and graze. We both stayed up all night those next few days, guns in hand, ready to shoot at the first sight of it coming again. Well, it never did. My buddy installs all sorts of expensive security equipment, cameras, etc., but nothing like that thing has ever been seen or heard on the property again. We will never know exactly what it was, and if it was hurt, or if there was more. But I will never forget seeing a human-like furry body with a dog's head and human eyes. It's by far the worst thing I have ever experienced, and I hope to God that I never see anything like it, ever again. I'm writing in about an experience I had in the spring, back in 2003. The date is stamped on my brain, just like the horrendous memories that I live with. I was a teacher at the time in Toronto, Canada. I taught children aged 8 to 9, primarily at a very small private school. Every year, we take the kids away on a field trip. This time, we took them out of town to some nearby lakes where we could camp with 2 other classes. It was always such a fun experience for the kids, and of course, the adults enjoyed it too. I was never an outdoorsy girl or so, but my main role was just ensuring all of the children were content and had everything they needed. On our last day, which was a Sunday, some of the children were going kayaking, and myself and another teacher would catch up on some of our report cards. At the end of the academic year, we would give our report cards to the children and their families, which, of course, would inform them of their progress thus far. We both sat on the slopes beside the lake as we waved them off and watched them disappear in their canoes with their guides. It was a slight embankment, but it was dry and filled with all sorts of foliage. We both giggled and made each other sunflower bracelets. It was quite perfect and an amazing start to summer. However, just then, I got a knot in my stomach when I heard some rustling behind us. For the first time, I could actually feel danger and sense it without ever hearing it or seeing it. Something large, an animal of some sorts. I looked behind me, but didn't notice anything right away. The ominous feelings stayed lingering. Then, we tried to continue chatting, having girly time. This time, however, we were both cast and covered in a black shadow. I looked up and saw the most enormous and bizarre-looking creature staring down at me with a ferocious, venomous look to its eyes. This creature had to have easily been 9 or 10 feet tall. I'm not joking you. It was a behemoth. The body kind of resembled a wolf, with pitch black, dark fur, giving it a seemingly very thick coat. You know how bears have a very thick coat of fur? It was like that, except black. But not black like a traditional black bear. It was darker, like it absorbed the light around it. I can't even begin to explain it. We both held each other, screaming in terror. This was clearly how we were both going to die. This thing, straight out of Halloween, was going to rip us apart. My eyes followed the beast's body, right up to its head, which I realized was that of a man and a wolf. It had human features, like the cheekbones and even the forehead bones, but it had a long muzzle, with large teeth protruding out from its jaws, even though its mouth wasn't even open. Its head also appeared to be bald almost, but with long ears. Maybe it wasn't really bald, but more just parts of hair missing on its face and head. It was the most bizarre looking thing I'd ever seen. This thing's teeth were fang-like and long, seeping down below its jaws. They looked like they can cause some serious damage. These were clearly the teeth of a killer. I trembled with such a fear that I had never felt since I was a child. I was wrapped tightly in my friend's arms, ready for the jaws of death to claim both of us. When I looked up again, this thing was drooling, a bizarre thick kind of slime that almost had a texture to it. The beast continued to eye us with curiosity and aggression, clearly relishing our terror and fear. Its expression was like it was getting off on it, like it was enjoying inciting that much fear and terror into both of us. It's almost like it wasn't even wanting to move or make a move, because it kept wanting to scare us. For a second, I thought about rising from the ground and attempting to batter the beast myself, like my late father would have done. But who am I kidding? I just continued to sob on the ground, whimpering, hoping that it eventually would retreat, leave us alone, or kill us both quickly. It was the beast's eyes that were the most foulsome. Red, with a hint of yellow. They probed us. They glowed. This thing had intelligence, and it seemed to stare into our souls and bodies. They were almost like little slits in the center. Not completely, but that's what it felt like. I've never had this feeling before, but I felt as if my body was literally breaking down from the sheer amount of terror and fear that I was experiencing, coursing through my body. This beast again opened its mouth, exposing all of its horrid teeth, and roared at both my friend and I. Its whole expression and body perched over us in pure hostility. We just continued screaming, this time not stopping for what felt like several minutes. When we opened our eyes, I looked up to see that this creature had vanished. Even the drool that had came out of its mouth and dripped on the ground in front of me was also gone. There was no evidence that it had been there at all. It was the spookiest thing, and I kept expecting it to jump out and attack us. But it appeared the coast was clear. We were safe, or falsely safe. We both hugged each other before running back to the cabin. When the rest of the staff saw us, they knew something had happened. We told the principal, who told us we both looked stressed and should take some time off work. We briefly sat down with them and explained what we saw. We were called in for psyche evaluations, but proved that nothing was wrong. Over the next few years, I received counseling regularly from skilled professionals who told me that the beast I saw was merely a metaphor for something going on in my life. Maybe something I didn't deal with in my childhood. But it was all bullshit. I knew what was going on. I tried to tell them. They wouldn't listen. I know what I saw. This was terrifying. Big and brutal. It was awful. It has plagued my dreams for years, and has made me afraid to go anywhere near the woods. Sometimes when I drive at night, I look to the side and expect to see the same creature watching over me, or even chasing me. The worst thing about it is I don't know what it was. I have never seen anything as terrifying in all my life. I have searched countlessly online, through magazines, websites, expecting to see some kind of evidence that would hint towards this thing's existence, only to find nothing. I am not a frequent internet user, but recently ventured onto the web when I spent some time Googling my description of the beast, and I came across many forums in which other people talked about sightings of what they call a Dogman. It seems the closest thing to what I saw, and the most plausible explanation. I have attempted art therapy to deal with the trauma of what I saw. In fact, just last year, myself and the other teacher reconnected after many, many years, and worked on a textile art piece in which we drew ourselves on the ground with a black figure above us. There is no doubt that this Dogman broke me. Whatever it was, has permanently changed my mental perspective. There are days that I'm just too fragile to go outdoors, but I try and I will. I hope that research on the internet will bring me to other people and groups, and we can begin a collective healing for all those who have encountered these allegedly mystical beasts. I think the number one terrifying takeaway from everything I've told you is the fact that it had total and complete control over us in that moment, for more than enough time to end our lives. But it didn't act out in violence. It didn't try to harm us. Instead, for whatever sick, twisted, sadistic reason, its intent and focus was on terrifying us and making us feel as much fear as possible. Why? I'll never know. But it was beyond traumatizing. And I believe that this thing fed off of every drop of fear we have, that it tried to pull that fear out of us. I'm not sure what it gained from it, but whatever it was feeding off of it. Where it went to, I don't know. I don't really believe in paranormal or ghosts, but it's very possible this thing has come from hell. When I was just a kid, my parents used to always tell me that there's all sorts of creatures outside that will eat you and kill you. But now I'm 19, and to be honest, a pretty friendless soul. The days are lonely, and the nights lonelier, even more so with COVID. It's a darn shame. I consider myself a good-looking girl, and deserve more for my life. So, during quarantine, when the world is standing still, I've decided to go and venture outside. Granted, I live just outside of St. Paul, Minnesota, which, I don't care what anybody says, is by far the most boring city in all the country. I mean, there's the mall, that's it. So in my neighborhood, which is on the north side of the city, this would have been around April, so the world was full of pooping bricks about the idea of COVID taking over. You know, back when everybody was hauling toilet paper, and the shelves were bare, and people were panicking. Well, life seemed boring, and the town was quiet. So I decided to venture out for once. I was sick of the lonely Friday nights, endlessly scrolling on Instagram, watching everybody else have a good time. I deserved to have one too, I thought. My parents were working at the hospital, both in ICU, so it was just me at the time, home by myself. After going on a long walk in town, I eventually found myself right near a basketball court, neighboring a small park. This is at nighttime, and I love urban exploration at night. So I sat there by the bushes on a bench, and I got the most eerie feeling that I've ever had. It was like I was being watched, and suddenly, I expected a serial killer or some sort of rapist to pursue me, just like in video games or in movies. but a deep shiver permeated through my entire body, even more so than I could have ever imagined. So much so that I actually twitched and jerked in my seat. I had a feeling to look behind me, and I did, resulting in me screaming. A large wolf was standing over me. I'm 5'2", and this thing was easily twice the size of me. I had to actually look up at it, and wondered, had I been drugged? This couldn't be real. It looked like it came out of a horror movie. A huge monster, with an orange glow to their eyes, was peering down at me. The creature had matted fur all over its body. It appeared to be black, or a smoky charcoal color. With the lighting, I couldn't exactly be sure. Its body was ripped, very athletic. Every muscle was pulsating underneath its thick fur. It was incredibly bizarre looking. Although in the moment, it seemed like a costume. I knew, in the core of my body, this was a real, living, breathing monster. My hands were sweating, and my heart racing. I knew my only chance of survival was to run, but my legs stood, stuck on the ground. My feet now bursting out of my heels as I fell backwards, not noticing the pain at all, with my eyes locked on this creature. The creature's face was completely dog-like. It looked like somebody took a German shepherd and glued it onto the body of this beast. It was terrible looking. The head itself was even larger than the body, disproportionately larger. As I squinted, I was able to take in the full horror of everything. I could see that it had fresh blood on its muzzle, and just continued to stare into me. I closed my eyes and prepared myself for the savagery that would be the end of my life. With my eyes shut tightly, I began sobbing uncontrollably. After waiting for the end, maybe a few seconds, I opened my eyes back up, and this thing continued staring at me, not moving. It was as if it was curious about me, like it was about to toy with me, like it was a hunter that came upon a dying buck. I had no idea what was about to happen, so I pulled my shoe off my foot and flung it at this creature before running away as fast as I could. When I got home, which I'm surprised I actually made it home, I spent the rest of the night in the hot shower, trying to protect myself with a knife in one hand, hoping that the hot water would mask any scent that I had on my body, in hopes that this thing wouldn't track me down. I vowed and cried in the shower to never pursue another night adventure ever again. I never told my parents what happened. If they found out that I ventured, they wouldn't kill me, but I would surely know punishment. I don't know what it is that I encountered, or why it didn't try and kill me. Why did it show curiosity in me? Why was it studying me, as if I was some vulnerable prey that it was about to pounce on? I've turned my questions to Reddit, and although I haven't been able to find much, I'm convinced this was some sort of demon, some sort of monster. Even thinking about this and talking about it sends shivers down my spine. You know, honestly, I was really considering not even writing this out and sending it in, because just going back to this memory is traumatic enough for me. Maybe I should send this out to as many people as I can to let them know there's something on the loose. But again, I don't want people to think I'm crazy, which is why I've shut down. People already think I'm weird, so I might just have to wait it out and see what happens. But I'm gonna send this to you in hopes that my story can get out there. Thank you for listening and the time to read this. My grandpa had told me a story about Dogman. I just didn't know it at the time. I was 7 years old when he began telling me about what it was like to live through World War II. See, he was drafted into the military and there wasn't much that the war offered that he didn't get to see. He always had a way of looking around as if unsure he was being watched or whatnot. I guess it's the remnant of being in a horrific war. It wasn't unusual for him to spin around without warning, expecting to see somebody following him. I did not understand this behavior for a very long time. One day, he pulled me aside while I was helping him with a few things in the yard, and he took me into his workshop. He said, "What do you think all these things have been for?" He gestured to a few things that I had, that I just accepted as being part of what war had done to him. He had several shotguns, one inside and outside of the house. He had one out in his workshop, and he had a pistol that he kept on him at all times. Yes, even while he slept. The man never let it get out of his sight. Not to mention the large combat knife that he always had strapped to his thigh. He sat me down and told me a story that I had heard many, many times before. That time he included all the details that he had left out, and it changed everything I thought I knew about him. The history books, according to him, weren't exactly telling the whole truth. It was indeed the Russians that gave the Nazis the push that they couldn't get back up from. But the Russians weren't the first to engage them for their last stand. The Nazis made it to their somewhat mythical national redoubt in time to dig in and prepare to push back against my grandfather and his company. The national redoubt tapped into a cave system that supposedly could sustain a determined army of Nazis for about 5 years. Pushing deeper into that cave system evidently caused some problems for the Nazis. This information my grandfather didn't come by until years and years later. All he knew was that when the call was made to move in on the last stronghold, the Nazis were already struggling with the creatures that looked like they came out of the darkest children's storybooks in the German countryside. Man-wolves, Grandpa called them. Towering, muscular, vicious beasts with their pointed ears drawn back in a primal rage. They resembled that of the Anubis creature from Egypt, often depicted in hieroglyphics. They attacked like bees of an invaded hive. My grandfather remembered seeing one of the walking wolves swipe at a Nazi officer and scrape the clothing and the skin right off his chest, exposing his raw, bare ribcage and flesh. He was pretty sure that he spotted halters and brittles on some of them, as if the Nazis had tried to tame some of the monsters. Their attempts to dominate the depths of the natural world had clearly failed. The man-wolves had reduced the enemy to a corpse, to be freshly picked clean. And then, they turned on my grandfather and his allies. Bullets didn't have as much stopping power with the creatures as they did the Nazis. If they had actually looked human, they could have been mistaken for super soldiers that the Nazis were trying to breed. My grandfather was a survivor, but even after making it back to America, he felt like the man-wolves were stalking him. He didn't know how they could do it, since it involved a trip across the ocean, but he was convinced that they had followed him. His argument was that the ocean has a bottom in the earth, and wherever there's earth, there's tunnels, no matter how deep you go. I have a very hard time digesting those logistics, let alone the notion of a bipedal humanoid wolf. But he lived his remaining years armed and ready for them if they ever stepped foot into his home. Grandfather has since passed. He died of natural causes. None of the cartridges he had ever stocked up on got fired into the heart of these dog creatures. But even I'll admit that I'm hesitant to ever sleep at his property, which he willed to me, just in case one of them really is out there, and it decides to pick up my scent and follow me, wherever I may go on this earth. Clearly, there are things more horrific than just your standard horrors of war that many people talk about. In fact, When many people talk about the term horrors of war, I think they're referring to the much darker side of things. Not just torture, violence, death, and destruction, but the things that you don't hear about, just like these Anubis-like creatures. I think we've all seen the videos made by people that will play with their cats in a hallway. Each time the camera noses around the corner, the cat is a little bit closer. I had a similar experience with something that wasn't a cat. Quite the opposite. Well, it was a dog. It had beefed up muscles, rippling under its coarse black fur, and it walked on two legs. Before I continue my story, I don't believe in werewolves. But if I did, this thing is how I would expect them to look. I was moving one of my friends out of a flat that was on the very edge of town. You could see the "Welcome to Hollybrook" sign from his window. The town, though small, had fallen under the shadow of gang violence. People were moving out as soon as they had the chance, and my friend was no exception. Despite living at the literal edge of town, my friend's flat wasn't very accessible. You had to find one specific frontage road, and that was the tricky part. I must have missed my turn, since I found myself in a maze of clustered houses and mobile homes on a cold and cloudy day. I was running out of time, so decided to stop and ask for directions. I thought I had seen somebody on their porch in a narrow alleyway, so I parked and approached. I mean, it was broad daylight, minus the clouds, and it was still small-town U.S.A. How much did I really have to worry about, after all? Either I had been hallucinating, or that person just didn't want to talk to me, since they evaded me swiftly and wouldn't answer when I knocked on the door. When I turned to look at my car, I saw a shape at the far end of the alley, tall and dark, standing perfectly still. I called out to them, but got no answer. I descended the steps of the home and went to call out again, but I noticed that the figure was much closer. Just as if they had sprinted closer in the time that I took my eyes off of them. Then I blinked. They were even closer. Finally close enough for me to get a look at them in the gray daylight. I thought it had just been a tall man in a coat. There was no way this was human. The first thing I noticed, besides the size, was the creature's eyes. They gave off a glow that the diffused sunlight couldn't dim. Every inch of its body was taut with physical strength. And that head. Dear God. Did such things really walk this earth, or crawl around inside of it? It looked every bit like a wolf, except the head had to have easily been as big as a bear's head. I began trembling with a creeping, crippling fear that was due as much to the way the beast looked, as much as the fact that the neighborhood was so claustrophobic. If I had to run, my escape routes would be few, and I would be turning around nothing but blind corners. This awareness caused panic to start snaking up my spine. The monster was a block away when I quickly dashed to my car. As soon as I was inside, long black claws were peeling ribbons of paint off my driver's side door. That instant of realizing that the thing was upon me is easily the worst feeling of my life. B-movies had taught me to more or less laugh at the word terror. That moment taught me to respect it, like some sort of powerful ancient deity. The beast howled in frustration when it could tell that I was beyond its grasp. I didn't make any phone calls or messages or anything. I simply got out of there, and I never went back. Why this creature that looked simply strong enough to rip the door off my car and pull me out? Why it didn't do that? I don't know. I guess I'll never know. I wish to remain completely anonymous. if I tell you my story, there is going to be somebody that will want to have me hunted down and killed. I prefer the term silenced, but you clearly get the picture that I'm painting. But the price of holding this story inside of me any longer would be much, much worse. I live east of your continent, where my comrades and I had been practicing drills in the wilderness with the aim of coming to America to incite terror while everybody is distracted by noisier events on the world stage. I can be forthright about this because all of my comrades are now dead. All of our training is carried out in confined conditions to sharpen our tactical senses. We favored a set of connected caves in a forest, which, from a teaching standpoint for military objectives, was perfect. The confined nature of the forest could be like the outdoor urban environment, while the caves could be like that of the inside of a building, interior environment. We always practiced with live ammunition. There is no substitute for the real thing, according to our teachers. We were also led into an unfamiliar branch of cavern to throw us off, and see how well we could adapt to the unknown. Nobody said a thing, but I could tell that we all felt it at once, the sensation of being followed and being watched. A few of our comrades began to say that the enemy soldiers had discovered us, but no enemy I'd ever faced in combat made me feel like that, what with the hair on my neck standing up. The presence revealed itself in the light of our electric torches. A wolf demon straight out of the stories my guardians would tell me, just to keep me from getting out of bed at night. Perhaps the sight of the demon would not have had so much power over me if I had not been told those old stories, because I felt just like I was a small boy, all over again, trembling in fear at the final revelation of what I had always heard and dreaded seeing. Once I remembered, I was a grown man soldier. I raised my rifle and shot the monster, using too many bullets than I should have. I couldn't make my finger let go of the trigger. It was as much of a lifeline as a weapon in that second. I almost didn't think that I had hit this demon, but then it took a few steps forward and fell clearly on its face. I had killed a legend from my own childhood, but I was not a hero, nor did I feel like one. Someone shouted that there were more, just like it, coming into our light, and I felt like a frightened rabbit whose burrow had been breached. Those who held our lights were also locked in the fight, so visibility was unstable. I believe that I accidentally cut down one or two of my comrades on accident, as the demons were standing among us by then. I was aiming for their heads at first, but my terror became overwhelming, and I nearly shot at anything that moved. My rifle ran dry, and so I ran for all I was worth. Let me tell you, after that day, I did not see much of that worth in myself anymore. I made it out of the cave system, and only a handful of my comrades were outside. I saw none of our teachers. The next day, I took my belongings and the money I had made between serving under our teachers and the looting from successful campaigns. I left without telling anybody. I was certain that I would be hunted down, but I realized days later who was left in our unit to even do the hunting. I have since ceased all interest in violence. I have gone off the radar completely with my life, as much as possible. I want nothing to do with any of this, or any kind of monsters. I understand that sending this to you, I'm putting a target on me